I want to use the theme of choosing narrative for my brief words tonight and tomorrow on Christianity. Ever since the very beginning of Oratora, I've always used this time to bring to our congregation different teachings from Christianity, different aspects of the New Testament, how Christianity was born in first century Judaism and so forth. And because of the rising anti-Semitism, I wanted to talk about this incredible change that happened in the Catholic Church that culminated in 1965 with a document called Nostra Aetate, which means in our time. I'll summarize it very briefly. But what's fascinating for me in reading, first of all, the history of the Christian churches in Germany, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, is stunning in its depravity. One cannot even imagine how a person who called him or herself a Christian by the 1930s and 40s had completely abandoned any sense of Christian faith. Some people called Hitler John the Baptist. Some people thought Hitler was actually the Messiah, and that Germany was now the new chosen people. It's too stunning and painful when you look how the Protestant Church identified with German nationalism, and the Catholic Church knew that it had to survive the war and more or less aided and abetted the Nazi cause. So when you see this, and of course, after the end of the Second World War, people tried to disavow, but things were in print, things had been said. And now the question was, what would Christianity do with its own history of, I don't like the word anti-Semitism, by the way. I was almost going to say it. Because it was a word that was invented in the 1880s to make Jew hatred something racial because of the deep ideas of so-called scientific racism in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So they didn't want to say they hated the Jews because of their belief, but rather it was a race, it was an impaired race, it was a defective race, it was a race with rotten and spoiled blood, and therefore should not be part of the European polity. So they invented a word, anti-Semitism, against the race of the Semites. It was as far as I know, is an invented word. We're really talking about anti-Judaism, meaning hatred of the ism of the Jews, hatred of Jewish belief, and also hatred of Jews. So I prefer anti-Judaism and anti-Jews. So where does this begin? Where does the Christian heritage of hatred of Judaism and hatred of Jews begin? Well, painfully, it's right in the New Testament. And I have to share with you, as I'm trimming my library, I went to a few of my commentaries on the New Testament that I've either had for a long time or people have given me. And I looked up the offending verses. I'm only going to mention two tonight. I looked up Matthew chapter 27, and I looked at John chapter 8. And I saw how the commentators just went straight through these chapters as if they had nothing to say. I really thought I was misreading the text. I went down to the notes, I looked what was happening, and the interpreters went by it as if nothing had happened. Now, these are, of course, late 20th century, early 21st century commentators. By the way, those are books I got rid of. If you go back to those offending passages that I will read to you, you understand how anti-Judaism and hatred of Jews developed certainly in the New Testament, and then became basically doctrinal with more or less ferocity in the history of the Christian churches. So I want to read from you a little bit from Matthew chapter 27, where it's the scene of the crucifixion. So there's been a supposed trial of Jesus. By the way, any scholar who has studied the trial of Jesus as it is presented in the New Testament can see immediately that it is a complete fabrication. There's nothing in the trial of Jesus that can accord with any part of our understanding of first century Judaism, especially first century Judaism court system. In any case, he's taken from this supposed trial, turned over to Pontius Pilate, and he gives them an option in Matthew between Barabbas and Jesus. He says, which will you want me to put to death? I'm sorry, which one do you want me to release? They say, Barabbas. What am I to do with Jesus, who's called Messiah? And with one voice they say, crucify him. And he says, why? What has he done? But they shouted, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate could see nothing that could be done. A riot was starting. And he basically wants to wash the blood off of himself. He took water and washed his hands in full view of the people. My hands are clean of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. And with one voice, the people cried, his blood will be on us and upon our children. And then he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The rest of the chapter shows the Jews jeering at Jesus, spitting on Jesus, mocking him, and so forth, until the end of this horrible scene of Jesus' death on the cross, and the last words of Jesus, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? So notice, as I would teach this, it said, all the Jews said of one voice. Sometimes I would say, certainly a little bit sarcastically, I don't think Jews have ever agreed on anything and said anything in one voice, so that's already my evidence that it didn't happen. A little more seriously, look how the author wants deliberately to impugn all the Jews in Judea, all the Jews living at that time, and the descendants of the Jews living at that time, that their hands are bloody with the blood of Jesus Christ. This is in Matthew 27. You'll see similar narratives. By the way, there's no crucifixion story in John, as far as I can tell. They're a bit different in Mark and Luke. Mark seems to be more spare. Luke seems to be much more evolved, which is one reason we think we understand the history of the New Testament and the sources that they shared together. But the other offending verse that I want to share with you, and again, it's very painful for me to read this, in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, Jesus having a dispute with the Jews. Much of the Gospel of John is rhetorical settings where the author of John has the opportunity to express what's called his Christology. Scholars of the New Testament know that Christology is presented differently in the Gospels, meaning their theory of Jesus, the Trinity and so forth, which is really not occur in the New Testament. And it's different with the different letters of Paul and so forth. So as what we'll call the Christology of Jesus is being developed in the book of John by the authors of the book of John, he has a confrontation. Again, I'm going to say a literarily, fabricated confrontation between John and the Jews. So he's they're saying that Abraham is their father. You'll see this toward the end of the Gospel of John. He says, if you dwell in the revelation I have brought, you are indeed my disciples. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So the truth is, as you will see, that you are the children of the devil. You're the children of Satan. And if you don't understand this truth, you are trapped in darkness. But if you admit that you are the children of the devil and children of Satan, that truth will set you free. So if you every time say the truth will set you free, you're referring to John, be careful when you say that and understand this source. They say, we are Abraham's descendants. And so Jesus goes on and says, you are bent on killing me because my teaching makes no headway with you. He goes on and says, they say to him, we are not base-born. God is our Father, God alone. He said, if you loved God, you would love me. Then he says to the Jews in John 8:44, your father is the devil, and you choose to carry out your father's desires, meaning the desires of the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning and is not rooted in the truth. There is no truth in him. When he tells a lie, he is speaking his own language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But I speak the truth. Which of you can prove to me wrong? If what I say is true, why do you not believe me? And the Jews answered and said, we are right in saying, and they continue the argument, and he basically accuses them of being possessed, not having the truth, and of course being saying that they're children of Satan. Now, I believe that Jesus existed. From years past, I actually have a theory of Jesus and how he fits squarely in the Jewish tradition of charismatic leaders, even of prophets, renewals. I think Jesus was part of a Jewish renewal movement in the first century. And I think if we can distill Jesus' message out of the New Testament, he's an incredibly important historical figure for first century Judaism. As I've discussed this with Christian scholars, one of our tragedies is a great Jew was taken away from us. I wish that the teachings of the first century teachings of Jesus remained in the Jewish tradition because they are a very important teaching. And again, if we can try to extract his teaching from the New Testament, we realize there's a crisis in first century Judaism, and that is the question of grace of God. Now, we find the idea of the grace of God and salvation of God throughout the Hebrew Bible. I was taught grace and salvation are Christian ideas. Judaism is mitzvahs and ethics, and it's just a bad teaching. Because if you read Psalms, if you read other parts of the Bible, it's clear that we are a religion of grace and salvation, as well as a religion of duties, obligations, mitzvahs, and so forth. The question is, how do you square them? And which is most important? Now, apparently, as first century Judaism developed, there was an idea of being punctilious with the mitzvot. You see this in some forms of orthodoxy today. If you are not punctilious with the letter of the law, somehow you've fallen out of grace with the divine. And there's another teaching, also in orthodoxy, that it's the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, because the spirit of the law guides the development of halakha. That's number one. And number two is the intentionality behind the mitzvot, which is more important than the observance of the mitzvah. This is a dispute within Orthodox Judaism. Of course, liberal Judaism, in my mind, a great mistake, has abandoned the concerns of grace and salvation, because I think many human beings are interested in what it means, as the Psalms say, to experience the love and grace of God. Now, I'm a person who has experienced that. And I saw it in the Jewish prayer book. And I remember when people say, well, that's a Christian idea, I say, it's all over our prayer book, it's all over Psalms. And I remember talking to a few of my professors, and I say, because of our animosity toward Christianity, we've taken something crucial out of our tradition, and people, I think, are yearning for the idea of the deep spiritual experience of the grace of God, and also salvation in the sense of the salve. The human condition is a wounded condition, and we are looking for a salve. We're looking at someone that will help heal us in this in this sometimes painful journey that we are on. So I want to emphasize, when I study the New Testament, I think I can extract out the teachings of first century Judaism that I think are crucial. However, when the Jerusalem church was destroyed, meaning the church in Jerusalem that was connected to first century Judaism, when that church was destroyed, the Jews were exiled from Judea. The only Christian church that was left, as far as we know, was the non-Jewish church, meaning so-called synagogues that were founded, and then, Christian places of worship that were founded throughout the mostly Asia Minor, Syria, etc. Now, they had no deep connection with Judaism, and there was a crisis. If God's covenant was with the people of Israel, how could Christians claim to have the covenant? So there developed a theory called the Supersessionism, meaning the Christian covenant superseded the Jewish covenant. Now, I remember talking to Christians, and I would quote from the Hebrew Bible, it's an eternal covenant between me and the Jewish people. We say this every time we say the Kiddush on Shabbat. Eternal covenant between me and the Jewish people. I look at my Christian conversation partner, I said, isn't that what God said in the Hebrew Bible? And the answer is yes, but because of the wickedness of the Jewish people, the Jews were pushed out of, you might say, the chain of the covenant, and Christianity was put instead. Now, this was a crisis in first century, early second century Christianity. And there were those who had, I think, had to portray the Jews and the time of Jesus, which we'll talk about in the 30s in the first century CE, as wicked people who wanted to murder Christ. Now, from my perspective, it might very well be true that if you look at the great disputes and animosity of the many different sects that were operating in Judaism in the first century, that they probably did hate each other. But notice it doesn't say that if you look at all the sectarian Judaisms of the first century, by the way, there was no Judaism in the first century, there were Judaisms. It eventually evolved into Rabbinic Judaism by the 2nd, 3rd century, but the first century in Judea was not a time where there was any kind of theological accord or even an accord of observance. What we call Judaism was in its embryonic state. There was not yet a Bible. The canonized Bible did not exist. That only began to come together in the 80s and 90s. There was no Mishnah. There was no Talmud. There was no code of Jewish law. It was something that was disorganized, embryonic. Again, there were schismatics and sectarians, and it evolved. So clearly, the early Jewish Christians were one of those sectarians. It's even hard to call it sectarian because there's no main teaching to be sectarian from. Meaning there were just different sects, and there was no one body that could say one was official and one was not. But notice that the authors, and again, I don't think these authors are speaking for God. In my mind, they're obviously not speaking for God. They're speaking out of a motive to understand how God could betray God's own words that says an eternal covenant between me and the people of Israel. So because they needed a reason for the supersession of the covenant, they needed to portray Jews in a light that would say that it was their wickedness that pushed them off the chain of the covenant. Now, you can read the history of anti-Semitism. It's a sad anti-Judaism, hatred of Jews. Again, it culminates in the Second World War in Germany, in Poland, and in other places. After the Second World War, clearly there was a great reckoning. And Christian theologians had to ask this, and this is Franklin Littell asked this book, and the one I'll talk about tomorrow. How could the most depraved teachings in the history of Christianity come out of the birthplace of Protestantism and probably the most intellectual church in the history of the church, which is the church in Germany? Certainly the medieval churches, but the idea of biblical scholarship, and you look at the great Christian interpreters of the Bible. It reached its peak in the end of the 1800s, 1910s, 1920s, and then it just stopped and was hijacked. So Franklin Littell asks, how deep was this Christianity if it could have been abandoned so quickly, so suddenly? And so his question is, was it just a veneer? Was Christianity just a veneer over savagery? Did anybody ever believe it? Because in a few short years, it could be completely abandoned and distorted. This is Franklin Littell's book. I'll talk about a little more tomorrow. Now, the Catholic Church, of course, they don't have a maverick like Franklin Littell. Remember, there is the papacy, and messages are carefully constructed. But throughout the 1950s, there was a crisis in the Catholic Church about what to do about the fact now that we've done something evil, number one. And number two, could it possibly be true that all other human beings have no relationship with God? Meaning, if God really is the author of history, why are there Hindus? Why are there Buddhists? Why are there Muslims? Is this part of some mysterious divine plan, implying when you read Nostra Aetate that these different religions have a truth that needs to share? And if you look at, again, the statement called In Our Time, that the Catholic Church has to listen to. It's an extraordinary statement, when you think about perspective, of a reckoning of leaders in Catholicism, 1950s and early 1960s, that knew that the perspective that had been created beginning in the New Testament and throughout Christian history there was evil in it because it produced such evil. And they had to ask themselves, well, what is our perspective about non-Catholics? What is our perspective about humanity? What is our perspective about the human condition? So when you read the works of that, it's called the Second Vatican Council, you'll see it's deeply influenced by two main forces. One is humanism, and the second is, not surprisingly, the modern liberal state of equal people before the law and equal people before God. It's as if these two ideas, which in many ways began among German theoreticians, the humanistic tradition it was formed in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and very deep aspects of what we'll call the moral foundation of the modern liberal state. While it's mostly a product of Scottish philosophy, it's very much rooted in Immanuel Kant and others, and certainly the ideas of Hegel. So the Catholic Church, when you read the history of the Nostra Aetate, there was a war in the Catholic Church. I mean, there are those who were dead set against the statement to understand that the Catholic Church is trying to understand the human condition, which is a mystery, and other religions have their own approach, and we should talk to each other. And then after the text talks about the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Muslims, then it comes to the Jews. Now, it's clearly written by a committee. It's a little bit mealy-mouthed for my taste, but it finally says we have to admit that Jesus was born of the stock of Abraham, more or less reversing John 8 and saying the stock of Abraham is a holy people that produced our religion, that produced Jesus. And the whole idea of the Supersessionism, where we have replaced Judaism, is disavowed. And then a claim that we must talk to the Jews. We must have dialogue. The ecumenical movement, ecce means a house, menical means world, like the one world community. We have to understand there's a one world community. We have to talk to each other. We have to listen. All this is published in Nostra Aetate in our time in 1965. The great force behind this was Pope John the 23rd. He died before this was published. Pope Paul VI took over, and he stayed loyal to the teachings of John the 23rd, who was clearly a force that changed the inner workings of the Catholic Church that we still see today. With the official approval of blessing same-sex marriages. That is the work of John the 23rd, extending into our time. So what I wanted to share with you, just as someone who studies the human condition and studies religion, what it's like to see the inner workings of the war in the Catholic Church, that those who say our theology is our theology, our teachings are our teachings, the New Testament is our New Testament, and someone who says it can't be what the New Testament says because it's depraved, because it's evil. Anything that would produce what we saw in the Second World War cannot be true. It doesn't matter if the New Testament says it. It cannot be true. What they said is, well, it was some Jews at that time. Again, they have the text. They can't ignore the text. But they just have to say it's been interpreted wrongly. Now, what do we mean by interpreted wrongly? A different perspective, a different lens. It's as if, and again, this is the power of Pope John the 23rd, we've been reading the Bible wrongly the entire history of the Christian church. And he says, we're going to have to read it differently. And I became aware of this all the way, as I said in my email. I was at the Hebrew Union College, and a job posting went on the board to teach Judaism in local Catholic high schools. I said, that sounds interesting. And I went up to the dean, I asked about it, and said, well, there's a thing called Nostra Aetate from 1965, and it came down, here we are 20 years later, but it came down that they are under a directive of the Vatican to reach out to Jews and have Jews come in and teach Judaism in Catholic high schools. So I'll do it. So for about 2 years of my life, I would visit different high schools, in Pomona and Covina and San Fernando Valley. I would have a thing that I did, and it was wonderful. The nuns were the teachers, and incredible connection, wonderful kids in the schools. It was an entirely positive experience for me, and I think for them. That all came out of Nostra Aetate. Now, in a way, what the church did is it repented of its deep and vicious anti-Semitism and showed that change was possible. What is my ultimate message here? This anti-Judaism, this hatred of Jews, has infiltrated our most elite universities. The more we discover, the more awful it is. The more we discover, the more awful the hatred of the state of Israel, in many ways the hatred of white people with this so-called critical race theory, critical theory gone very bad. This vulgar interpretation of Marx, we'll call it neo-Marxism. This false flag of DEI, it has permeated these institutions. I think I read in the Wall Street Journal today that there's a class at Princeton where there's a teacher that I think all graduates have to take the class she calls it the anti-Zionist hermeneutic. You know, how to interpret modern society from the foundational basis of the hatred of the state of Israel. Like that's their basis for teaching. Now, it has permeated deeply. And I imagine at a time, hopefully not too long in the future, there will be a president of a university who will see one of these demonstrations, walk out with a megaphone and shame in public those are calling for genocide, the destruction of the state of Israel, and address their professors and saying, you've not been teaching history. You've been teaching a racist ideology, and it stops here. And uproot every one of those syllabi, uproot every one of those courses that teaches what the Catholic Church used to teach. Now, if the Catholic Church can do it, our universities can do it. And this is part of our work. As I've been saying incessantly recently, it is our work to understand where our young people are going to school, look at these syllabi, look at this teaching, and do our job of making sure our children do not go near these radical ideologues that hate Western civilization, hate what our lives are based on, which is the moral foundations of the liberal state, and truly perverting with a horrible ideology the minds of one generation of young people after the next. This is our job to undo this. And so as I was reading Nostra Aetate and reading the history of Nostra Aetate, it's actually quite inspiring for me. It's very inspiring for me to see the world of ideas behind the scenes in the Catholic Church that produced a document in 1965 that for scholars of religion was stupefying, was unbelievable, that the Catholic Church, where all of its infighting, could produce something that certainly changed the change in the Catholic Church. Now, by the way, in my opinion, part of what's happening now in the Vatican is they're moving away from, I think, Vatican II and an understanding of the deep interconnection between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people. I hope that gets repaired quickly. So my goal tonight was, instead of teaching another gospel from the New Testament, one of the letters of Paul, Christian Neoplatonism, my favorite themes over the years, I wanted to teach what you might call the renewal and redemption of the church after the Second World War. And tomorrow I want to talk about an absolute force of nature in Franklin Littell. Born in Germany, he witnessed the Nuremberg rallies, emigrated to America, went back and advised the American occupation forces in Germany on how to restore the Protestant churches to their true mission. So he was an advisor to, as it were, bring the Protestant church in Germany back to its senses. Comes back to America and realizes the Protestant churches have no idea what happened. And he went on a one-person crusade, I will call it a crusade, to save Christianity from itself. It's an incredibly inspiring story, and I wanted to tell you his story as an inspiration for us. If you want to look this up, Franklin Littell, The Crucifixion of the Jews, and I'll be talking about it in some detail tomorrow. I hope it inspires you. I hope it tells you that change is possible, that we are not simply a product of social constructs, that we change our social constructs, we change our perspectives, we change our narratives, and we human beings are capable of profound transformation if we are guided by a certain light, and I believe this light is from God, and that is the essential equality of human beings before God and before the law, before the natural law, and any teaching that teaches there are different kinds of human beings, different kinds of consciousness, depending on the color of your skin, depending on your religion or where you live, that somehow that changes the nature of humanity, it's a disgusting idea. It's antithetical to everything we believe, and we need to expose this for what it is, and in my mind, capture that truth that funded the transformation of the church is a deep understanding of the human condition, meaning equal people before God and before the law.